Every single day, $3.5 billion worth of goods and services crosses the U.S.-Canada border, and in exactly 6 months, on July 1st, 2026, Donald Trump gets the legal power to kill all of it with a single signature. While Americans were distracted watching Trump's military operation capture Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro this weekend, the real economic invasion is happening much closer to home, and it's not being fought with 150 aircraft and special forces. It's being fought with tariffs, trade reviews, and what Trump himself calls economic force. The same man who just told reporters he'll run Venezuela until a proper transition happens has already told the world he's prepared to use economic pressure to make Canada the 51st state, and the clock is ticking louder than most people realize. Let's be brutally clear about what's actually at stake here. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA as Canadians call it, or USMCA as Americans know it, currently allows 85% of all trade between the U.S. and Canada to flow completely tariff-free. That's not a small deal. That's not even a big deal. That's the entire foundation of both economies working together for the past 16 years since NAFTA was replaced. More than $3.5 billion crosses that border every single day. That's over $1.2 trillion per year in trade that depends on this agreement staying alive. And on July 1st, 2026, all three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, are required by the agreement itself to sit down for what's called a joint review to decide whether CUSMA continues for another 16 years or whether it dies right there at the table. Now here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean absolutely terrifying if you're Canadian. The review was designed to be exactly that, a review. A chance to fix small problems, update a few clauses, make sure everything still works in a changing global economy. It was never meant to be a full renegotiation. It was supposed to be a formality, a rubber stamp, a quick check-in, before extending the deal for another 16 years and going back to business as usual. But Trump has already signaled multiple times in multiple ways that he views July 2026 not as a review but as leverage, as an opportunity, as a chance to extract concessions from Canada and Mexico or walk away entirely. And if you think Trump is bluffing, I'd like to remind you that this man just ordered the largest military operation in Latin America since the invasion of Panama in 1990, captured a sitting president, and announced on live television that the United States will now run Venezuela. Does that sound like someone who bluffs about using power? The numbers tell a story that should make every Canadian economist lose sleep at night. Trade accounts for 67% of Canada's entire GDP. Think about that for a second. 2/3 of Canada's economic output is directly tied to trade, and the overwhelming majority of that trade is with the United States. For comparison, trade accounts for only 24% of U.S. GDP. The power imbalance here isn't subtle. Canada needs the U.S. far, far more than the U.S. needs Canada. And Trump knows it, his cabinet knows it, and every single person sitting in those trade negotiation rooms knows it. Mexico is in a similar position with 73% of their GDP tied to trade, but at least Mexico has been more willing to play ball with Trump's demands. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has tried to stand firm, tried to maintain dignity, tried to negotiate from a position of strength. And where has that gotten them? Let me paint you a picture of what Trump has already done to Canada without even getting to the July review yet. In February 2025, Trump announced 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy. He framed it as a response to fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration, which, if you know anything about the U.S.-Canada border, is almost hilariously absurd compared to the U.S.-Mexico border situation. But facts have never gotten in the way of a good Trump tariff policy. The 25% tariffs hit steel, aluminum, lumber, furniture, kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, basically every physical product you can think of. And while Trump eventually created what's called the CUSMA exemption, which allows businesses to avoid the tariffs if they can prove their products were substantially made in North America, that exemption only applies to the 25% blanket tariffs, not the sector-specific tariffs that have been piling up like a train wreck in slow motion. Steel and aluminum tariffs? Those are still hitting Canadian producers at 25% with no exemption. Lumber tariffs? Trump added a 10% tariff on top of the existing anti-dumping duties that Canadian lumber companies were already paying. Kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities, those started at 25% in October 2025, and were scheduled to jump to 50% on January 1st, 2026. Trump delayed that increase by 1 year on New Year's Eve, which Canadian cabinet makers celebrated like someone just delayed their execution instead of canceling it. The furniture industry got hit with 25% tariffs that were supposed to increase to 30%, also delayed, but not eliminated. Every single one of these industries is now operating in what economists politely call survival mode, and what industry leaders less politely call we're getting destroyed and nobody in Washington cares. The Canadian Kitchen Cabinet Association released a statement in early January saying that layoffs have already started even before the 50% tariffs were supposed to hit. Let that sink in. The tariffs were delayed, and companies are still firing workers because they know what's coming. They know the delay is temporary. They know Trump is just waiting for the right moment to bring the hammer down even harder. Luke Elias, the vice president of the association, said the 25% tariffs that are already in effect have been devastating enough. The proposed 50% increase would have been extinction level. But even with the delay, companies can't plan, can't invest, can't hire, because they have no idea what the trade environment will look like in 6 months, in 1 year, in 2 years. And that uncertainty is almost as destructive as the tariffs themselves. Now let's talk about what Trump is actually trying to accomplish here. Because if you think this is just about trade deficits and fentanyl, you haven't been paying attention. Trump has said, out loud, in public, on multiple occasions, that he believes Canada should become the 51st state. He's joked about it. He's mused about it. He said he wouldn't use military force, but he could use economic force to make it happen. And every single time he says something like that, Canadian politicians treat it like a joke, like Trump being Trump, like, oh, there he goes again with the wild statements. But here's the thing. Trump doesn't joke about power. He jokes about everything else. But when he talks about expanding American power, about using economic leverage, about forcing other countries into submission, he's telling you exactly what he's planning to do. The man just proved he's willing to invade a sovereign nation, capture its leader, and announce that America will run that country indefinitely. Why would anyone think Canada is safe from economic coercion? Let me walk you through the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Trump views relationships with other countries purely through the lens of power and leverage. If he can't control you militarily, he'll control you economically. If he can't control you economically, he'll control you through political pressure and chaos. Venezuela refused to cooperate with U.S. demands, refused to step down despite election fraud allegations, and continued to operate as a thorn in America's side in Latin America. So Trump sent 150-plus aircraft, conducted large-scale strikes on Caracas, captured Maduro and his wife, flew them to New York, and announced the U.S. will run Venezuela until further notice. That's the military option, when a country is small enough, weak enough, and hated enough internationally that nobody will seriously push back. But Canada? Canada is a G7 nation. Canada is a NATO ally. Canada has deep cultural, economic, and political ties to Europe. Canada can't be invaded without triggering a complete collapse of the international order and probably World War III. So Trump uses the economic option. He imposes tariffs that devastate Canadian industries. He threatens to walk away from CUSMA entirely. He makes it impossible for Canadian businesses to plan or invest. He watches as Canadian tourism to the U.S. drops by 40% because Canadians are so angry they're boycotting American vacations. He watches as 62% of Canadians in polls say they're avoiding travel to the United States for the next year. He watches as the Canadian economy hemorrhages $18.5 billion in trade losses. And then he offers Canada a choice. Give me what I want in the July 2026 review, or I walk away from CUSMA entirely, and you face economic devastation. Here's what Trump wants, based on everything his administration has said and done over the past year. He wants Canada to dramatically increase defense spending to meet NATO's 2% of GDP target, which Canada has historically failed to do. He wants Canada to crack down even harder on border security, even though the U.S.-Canada border is already one of the most secure borders in the world, and accounts for a tiny fraction of illegal immigration and drug trafficking compared to the southern border. He wants Canada to give American companies better access to Canadian markets, particularly in agriculture and dairy, where Canada has protected its farmers through supply management systems. He wants Canada to back off on digital services taxes that affect American tech giants. He wants Canada to support American foreign policy positions more aggressively, particularly regarding China. And most importantly, he wants Canada to understand viscerally that the relationship between the U.S. and Canada is not a partnership of equals. It's a relationship where the United States has all the leverage and Canada exists at American pleasure. Mark Carney, who became Canada's Prime Minister after Justin Trudeau's resignation in early 2025, has tried to navigate this nightmare scenario by giving Trump some of what he wants while holding firm on Canadian sovereignty. Carney suspended Canada's digital services tax. He dramatically increased border security funding and personnel. He dropped most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs that had been imposed in response to Trump's initial tariff wave. He boosted defense spending, though not to the full 2% NATO target. He traveled to the White House twice for meetings with Trump, and both times the two leaders smiled for cameras, exchanged pleasantries, and seemed to be making progress toward a deal. Media reports in mid-October 2025 suggested that some kind of framework for easing tariffs was close to being finalized. And then Trump saw a television commercial. The Ontario government, trying to build public support for standing up to American tariffs, produced an ad that featured a quote from Ronald Reagan criticizing protectionism and tariffs. It was a clever political move. Use a Republican icon's own words against Republican tariff policy. It should have been a minor story, a footnote in the broader trade war narrative. Instead, Trump completely lost his mind. He was so offended by a Canadian province using Reagan's words against him that he immediately terminated all trade talks with Canada. Not paused, not delayed, terminated. The framework that had been months in the making, the progress that Carney thought he had made by giving in on so many other issues, all of it evaporated because Trump's ego couldn't handle being compared unfavorably to Ronald Reagan by a Canadian provincial government. That incident tells you everything you need to know about what Canada is facing in the July 2026 review. This isn't a normal negotiation where both sides have legitimate grievances and work toward compromise. This is a hostage situation where one side has all the power and the other side is desperately trying to avoid economic execution. Trump doesn't care about fair deals. He doesn't care about win-win outcomes. He cares about winning and making sure everyone knows he won. He cares about extracting maximum concessions while giving up as little as possible. He cares about breaking the other side's will to resist. And if a single television commercial can make him walk away from months of negotiations, what do you think will happen if Canada pushes back on any major demand during the July review? The economic damage that Trump has already inflicted on Canada is staggering, and this is before CUSMA is even up for review. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40% in February 2025 compared to February 2024. That's not a small decline. That's a collapse. Americans love to talk about how much they value the Canadian tourism market, how Canadian visitors are polite and spend money and fill up hotels in border states. Well, Trump successfully made Canadians hate traveling to America so much that they're canceling vacations, avoiding cross-border shopping trips, and telling pollsters they won't visit the U.S. for at least a year. The economic impact on American tourism is estimated at $4 billion per year. That's $4 billion that American hotels, restaurants, attractions, and retailers are losing because Trump decided to start a trade war with America's friendliest neighbor and biggest trading partner. But it gets worse. Canadian businesses, facing tariff uncertainty and hostile trade environment, have been desperately trying to diversify away from American markets. According to economic analysis, Canadian firms have recovered about $11 billion of the $18.5 billion in trade losses by finding 27 new trading partners and expanding relationships with existing non-U.S. partners. That might sound like good news for Canada, but it's terrible news for American businesses that used to have Canadian companies as reliable customers and partners. Every dollar of Canadian business that shifts to Europe, Asia, or Latin America is a dollar that's not coming back to American companies, even if Trump eventually backs down on tariffs. The trade war isn't just causing temporary damage. It's fundamentally restructuring supply chains and business relationships in ways that will last decades. The Canadian steel industry has been particularly devastated. Trump's tariffs reduced steel import quotas to 20% of 2024 levels for non-free trade agreement partners. Canadian steel used in manufacturing, food and beverage packaging, and agricultural production saw its tariff exemption expire on January 31, 2026. Yes, that's 5 days ago as I'm writing this. The only steel that still has temporary exemption is steel used for automobiles, auto parts, and aerospace products. And that exemption expires on June 30th, 2026, which is conveniently right before the July 1st CUSMA review. Trump is systematically removing every buffer, every temporary relief, every exemption, timing it all to maximize pressure right before the review happens. This isn't accidental. This is strategic economic warfare designed to make Canada as desperate as possible going into negotiations. Economists who have studied the situation are using phrases that should terrify anyone who cares about Canada's economic future. Tony Stillo, Director of Canada Economics at Oxford Economics, said that if CUSMA ends or is not renewed, it would be a worst-case scenario that would put the full weight of current tariffs without compliance or exemptions or carve-outs on the economy. He said earlier in 2025 his firm was forecasting a sharp recession for Canada, but the CUSMA exemption and Ottawa's decision to drop retaliatory tariffs pulled the economy out of quicksand. Without CUSMA, Stillo said, Canada's economy would face longer-term scarring, and the size of the economy would be lower for several years, probably permanently. Read that again. Permanently. Not a recession that you recover from, not a temporary setback. A permanent reduction in the size of Canada's economy. That's what's at stake in July. Another economist, Ari Pellerin, pointed out that the CUSMA review was designed to be just that, a review, not a renegotiation. It was supposed to be a chance to fix minor issues, make small adjustments, ensure the agreement stays fit for purpose. But Trump's administration has already signaled they view it as a full renegotiation opportunity, and they're willing to walk away if they don't get what they want. Pellerin said the CUSMA exemption itself is absolutely at risk in next year's talks, especially given that Trump's tariffs are already running counter to the spirit of the agreement. In other words, Trump is violating CUSMA right now with his sector-specific tariffs, and instead of Canada being able to challenge that, Trump is going to use the July review to make his violations permanent and extract even more concessions in exchange for not blowing up the entire agreement. The political situation in Canada has become increasingly unstable as the trade war has escalated. Justin Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister since 2015, saw his Liberal Party trailing the Conservative opposition by over 20 points in polls for months leading up to the trade war. Trudeau was deeply unpopular, seen as ineffective, out of touch, and unable to handle Trump. But something interesting happened when Trump's tariffs hit and Trump started openly talking about annexing Canada. Canadians rallied around the flag. The polling gap started closing. Trudeau announced his resignation in early 2025, and Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and former governor of the Bank of England, took over as Prime Minister. Carney was supposed to be the serious economic mind who could go toe-to-toe with Trump on trade issues. But even Carney, with all his credentials and experience, has been unable to make real progress with Trump. The Ontario commercial incident showed just how impossible it is to negotiate with someone who will blow up months of work over a perceived slight. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario and head of the Council of the Federation, became so concerned about the trade situation that he called a snap provincial election for February 27, 2025, saying he wanted a stronger mandate from voters to oppose Trump's tariffs. Think about that. A provincial premier called an early election specifically to get public backing to fight an American president's trade policy. That's not normal. That's not how stable, prosperous countries operate. That's what happens when your entire economy is being held hostage by a foreign leader's whims. Even more dramatic, Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, pledged to hold a referendum on Alberta separating from Canada if enough voters sign a petition in favor of it. The Alberta Prosperity Project needs to collect just under 178,000 signatures by May 2nd, 2026, to qualify the separation question for a referendum. And they're collecting those signatures. Alberta, Canada's oil-rich province, is so frustrated with how the federal government in Ottawa has handled Trump's trade war, so angry about how their economy is being destroyed by American tariffs, that a significant portion of the population is willing to consider breaking up Canada entirely. If that doesn't illustrate how serious the crisis has become, I don't know what does. Let me bring this back to Venezuela for a moment because the parallels are impossible to ignore once you see them. Trump just demonstrated that he's willing to use overwhelming military force to remove a leader he doesn't like, capture that leader, put him on trial in American courts, and announce that America will directly govern a foreign country until a transition Trump approves of takes place. The legal and international relations experts are calling it a massive violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and the UN Charter. South American countries are condemning it. European allies are issuing carefully worded statements that express concern without directly criticizing the U.S. And Trump doesn't care. He got what he wanted. He removed Maduro. He sent a message to every other Latin American leader that if you cross the United States, if you don't do what we say, if you become enough of a problem, we will come for you, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. Now apply that logic to Canada. Trump can't invade Canada militarily without triggering World War III and destroying NATO, but he can absolutely invade Canada economically. He can impose tariffs that devastate Canadian industries. He can threaten to end CUSMA. He can watch as Canadian businesses fail, Canadian workers lose jobs, Canadian provinces consider separation, and the Canadian economy shrinks permanently. And then he can offer Canada a deal. Give me everything I want. Accept that you're a subordinate partner. Understand that your economic survival depends on American goodwill, or I'll let your economy collapse. That's not a negotiation. That's extortion. And it's going to happen in exactly 6 months. Trump has already said publicly that he views the CUSMA exemption as something he's generously allowing Canada to have. Mark Carney has tried to spin it as the best trade deal of any country with the U.S., which is technically true in the sense that having 85% of your trade tariff-free is better than what most countries get from Trump's America. But calling it the best deal is like a hostage calling their chains comfortable because at least they're not being beaten every day. It's not a deal. It's a temporary stay of execution that Trump can revoke whenever he feels like it. The Bank of Canada, trying to assess the economic damage, calculated that the effective or average U.S. tariff rate on Canadian goods, factoring in the CUSMA exemption and all the sector-specific tariffs, has dramatically increased Canada's cost of doing business with its largest trading partner. Canadian businesses now have to hire lawyers to prove CUSMA compliance, file extensive paperwork, deal with customs delays, and constantly worry about whether Trump is going to wake up angry one morning and announce a new tariff on whatever industry he feels like targeting that day. The uncertainty alone is killing investment. Why would any business build a new factory in Canada or expand operations when they have no idea what the trade environment will look like in 6 months? And here's the really insidious part of Trump's strategy. By maintaining the CUSMA exemption while simultaneously imposing sector-specific tariffs, Trump has created a two-tiered system where he gets to pick winners and losers. Industries that comply with CUSMA and can prove North American content get to avoid the 35% blanket tariff. Industries that Trump has decided to target, steel, aluminum, lumber, furniture, cabinets, get hit with tariffs regardless of CUSMA compliance. This gives Trump enormous leverage. He can threaten to move any industry from the exemption category to the tariff category whenever he wants. He can promise to ease tariffs on one sector in exchange for concessions on another. He can play Canadian provinces against each other, offering better treatment to provinces that are friendlier to American interests while punishing provinces whose leaders criticize him. The July 1st, 2026 review is going to be a masterclass in coercive negotiation. Trump is going to walk into that meeting with Canada and Mexico desperate for the agreement to continue, with Canadian industries already devastated by existing tariffs, with the Canadian economy facing permanent damage if CUSMA ends, and with every temporary exemption and relief measure set to expire right around the review date. He's going to have a list of demands. Some of them will be reasonable. Some of them will be outrageous. All of them will be non-negotiable. And Canada is going to have to decide whether to give Trump everything he wants or risk economic collapse. Mark Carney is going to sit across from Trump, Mike Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and the rest of Trump's cabinet, and he's going to have to smile and negotiate and act like this is a normal trade discussion between partners. But everyone in that room will know the truth. Trump holds all the cards. Canada has no leverage. The only question is how much Canada is willing to give up to keep CUSMA alive, and whether Trump will even accept Canada's surrender, or if he'll decide that ending the agreement entirely serves his political interests better. Some analysts think Trump is starting to recognize that tariffs are hurting American consumers and businesses as much as they're hurting Canada. In November 2025, the United States rolled back tariffs on coffee, beef, and other consumer staples that had been facing sharp inflation. Maybe, these analysts suggest, Trump is realizing that tariffs are a blunt instrument that causes collateral damage to American interests. Maybe he'll soften his approach. Maybe the July review will result in a compromise where tariffs are reduced, CUSMA continues with minor modifications, and everyone moves forward. I think those analysts are huffing pure hopium. Trump just invaded Venezuela, captured its president, and announced America will govern that country indefinitely. Does that sound like someone who's learned the error of his ways and is ready to compromise? Trump views tariffs not as an economic policy tool, but as a weapon. The fact that they cause some pain to Americans is irrelevant as long as they cause more pain to the target country and advance Trump's political goals. And Trump's political goals include demonstrating American dominance, punishing countries that don't submit to American demands, and creating a global order where everyone understands that opposing the United States has consequences. Canada has 6 months to figure out how to survive what's coming. 6 months to decide what they're willing to give up to keep CUSMA alive. 6 months to prepare for the possibility that Trump walks away from the agreement entirely and Canada faces permanent economic damage. 6 months to watch as every temporary relief measure expires, as more industries get hit with tariffs, as public anger grows, and as provinces like Alberta seriously consider whether staying part of Canada is even worth it anymore if the federal government can't protect them from American economic warfare. The $3.5 billion that crosses the U.S.-Canada border every single day isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's jobs, it's factories, it's supply chains that have been built over decades. It's communities on both sides of the border that depend on cross-border trade to survive. It's the foundational assumption that the United States and Canada, despite all their differences, are partners who work together because cooperation benefits both countries. Trump is systematically destroying that assumption and replacing it with a new reality. America does what it wants, and everyone else either submits or suffers. July 1st, 2026 is going to be one of the most important dates in modern Canadian history. Either CUSMA survives and Canada accepts whatever humiliating terms Trump demands in exchange for keeping the agreement alive, or CUSMA dies and Canada faces economic devastation while scrambling to rebuild its trading relationships with the rest of the world. There's no good outcome here. There's only degrees of bad. And every single day between now and July 1st, another $3.5 billion in trade hangs in the balance, dependent on the whims of a man who just proved he's willing to invade countries and capture presidents to get what he wants. So when you hear politicians talking about the CUSMA review like it's a routine meeting, like it's just a normal part of maintaining trade agreements, understand what's really happening. This isn't a review, this is a reckoning. And Canada is about to find out exactly how much sovereignty they're willing to trade for economic survival.